Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So I have been looking at something here for a few months now, and I finally was able to create it successfully and have it operational. I don't usually talk too much about home automation because I use a Habitat home automation hub, and I'm really satisfied with it. And there's a lot of people that cover Habitat as well as Home Assistant. But Home Assistant provides some additional capabilities, and so what I ended up doing was I ended up creating a Home Assistant installation, and I connected it back to my Habitat environment. And so now in Home Assistant, I'm basically have all the switches shared back from my Habitat, and I'm able to control them. So today we're going to talk about a LXD virtual machine for Home Assistant. So I've covered LXD virtual machines before, and Home Assistant is usually installed from a disk image such as an appliance. And one of the most common installations you'll see for Home Assistant is flashing an image over to a Raspberry Pi, and then you have a pre-installed instance of Home Assistant, and it's fairly easy. So we're going to be reviewing something they refer to as the Home Assistant Advanced Installation, and it installs something called Home Assistant Supervised. Now, on the channel before, I've covered LXD virtual machines for Ubuntu and LXD virtual machines for Windows 11. And in this case, we're going to be covering a LXD virtual machine for Home Assistant. So when Home Assistant is installed in this way, that is from the disk image, it's referred to as the Home Assistant OS. It's basically kind of a no user serviceable parts inside and not really something amenable to installing to a LXD virtual machine. So Home Assistant Agent is a critical component which is used both for Home Assistant OS, the image, and the Home Assistant Supervised installation type, which we're going to discuss here. So we've got two components. We're going to have the Home Assistant Agent and the Home Assistant Supervised. So the agent allows the Home Assistant Supervisor to communicate with the host operating system and make any necessary changes or calls through that host operating system. And that's one of the reasons why they like to have a very solidly known environment, and it needs to be a dedicated environment, and that's why they like to distribute it as an appliance. So Home Assistant Supervised provides the full Home Assistant experience on a regular operating system without the Home Assistant operating system. So we're going to install Home Assistant Agent and Home Assistant Supervised on a LXD VM running Debian Bullseye. And Debian Bullseye is the requirement that they have for performing an installation of Home Assistant in this particular way. So here we are at my Home Assistant login screen, and I'm going to go up to my Bitwarden and log in with my username and password credentials. I click login and ask for my two-factor authentication key because I always encourage TOTP or some kind of two-factor authentication on your internet-facing services. So here we are, and all of these switches and things that you see are all being inherited over from the Habitat environment into my Home Assistant LXD VM instance. So the first thing I'm going to do is go down to my account in the lower left-hand corner by clicking on Scott, and I'm going to select the dark theme so that we all don't go blind. So we can go over here to settings, and we can see all the regular settings options are in here. We can go into the About screen, and you can see that I'm running the latest version of Home Assistant Supervisor, which is 2023.6.2. too. And I've upgraded it consistently ever since I put this LXD VM a couple of months ago, and it's operated very smoothly. I can go off to other dashboards. For example, I have one here that shows my various thermostats around the house here, and we're all in Fahrenheit in the US. So you can see here that my attic temperature is currently 112 degrees, just past noon. So the outside temperature is 97 degrees Fahrenheit. And then inside the house, of course, it's a lot cooler. And in the computer room, it's very cool. So anyway, let's go off and see exactly how it is that we create this Home Assistant supervised installation in a LXD virtual machine. So here I am at the prompt on my LXD host, and if I do a LXD list, I have an Ubuntu VM, which is a LXD VM, and I have a Windows 11 LXD VM, both of which were covered on videos on the channel before. And also, you're probably going to want to go back and watch the video on LXD 101 because you're going to need to have your LXD set up properly and set up with a bridge, as I talk about frequently on the channel. So here is an example of the command that we're going to use to fire up our image. We're doing a LXD init. Image is Debian 11, which is Debian Bullseye, and then --VM to let the system know that this is not a LXD container, but a LXD virtual machine. We're naming it Home Assistant. We're using the default profile, which tells it where to place the storage. And then we're using the bridge profile, which I've covered on the LXD 101 video, and it talks about how to create a bridge to present this container out onto your main LAN. I'm setting boot.autostart equal to true, which means that every time the LXD host boots, this container also starts. And then I have the CPU limits at 4 virtual CPUs, and then I have the memory limit at 4 gigabytes. One of the beauties of using a LXD VM for this purpose is we can change those memory and CPU limits at any time that we want. So I hit enter, it says creating Home Assistant, and now it has created the Home Assistant container, but it has not yet started it. And the reason it hasn't started it is because we have a couple of other things that we need to do prior to starting the container. One of the things we need to do is to enlarge the size of the disk. And the reason for that is because this Debian LXD container is only 9 gigabytes in size, and that's not sufficient to contain everything that we need. So I do a LXD config device override Home Assistant root space size equals 100 gigabytes, and there I'm making the disk 100 gigabytes in size. But it's not really totally configured for that size yet, and you're going to see that shortly. Something else that we want to do, and you'll have to do a LSUSB on your LXD host. You can see all of your LXD, or you can see all of your USB devices out here. Now, I don't have one, but you might have a USB Zigbee radio or a USB Z-Wave radio, and you probably want to connect those so that if you don't have Habitat like I do, and you want your Home Assistant to directly recognize Z-Wave or Zigbee devices on your network, you need the appropriate radios. But when you connect those radios, they're going to be on the LXD host, and we have to have a way to make those accessible by the container. So as I've discussed before also on the channel, when you look at LSUSB, the first number is normally a vendor ID, and the number after the colon is a device ID. And so, as an example, I'm just going to set something up here where I'm going to say LXC config device add home assistant, the name of the container, and I'm going to say we're going to pretend that I have a Z-Wave radio. It's a USB device, and we're just going to say the vendor ID is A012, the first number before the colon, and then the product ID is 4A01, which would be the number after the colon. And I hit enter, and that's associated. So then if I had a Zigbee radio, I would do a similar command, except that instead of calling it Z-Wave, I'd call it Zigbee, and then I would change the appropriate vendor ID and product ID for that. And what that will do is it will associate those USB devices plugged into my LXD host to this particular home assistant container. So now we want to boot up our container, and we do that like we would start a LXD container with a LXC start home assistant. The only thing about this is it takes a little bit longer to start a LXD virtual machine than it does to start an ordinary LXD container. And one of the ways that I can tell whether it's fully started for us to be able to do everything that we need is I can do a LXC list command, and I'm waiting for, even though it says it's running, you can see that it does not yet have an address on the network, and I really would like to wait for it to have an address. So we'll go ahead and clear the screen, and we'll do another LXC list, and it still does not have an address. So we'll just wait here a couple of more seconds, and it should get that address any time now. It's really in the process of booting up and also connecting to the network. So I do another LXC list, and there we go. We have both an IPv4 and an IPv6 address for our Home Assistant Debian instance. So I'm doing a LXC exec Home Assistant Bosh, which connects to the Bosh shell on this Home Assistant instance that we just created. The first thing I want to do here is I want to do a apt update ampersand apt upgrade -y, which is always a good practice anytime you create a new container or a new virtual machine, just to make sure you're completely up to date. And as you can see here, I am. So if you'll remember, we set the size of this disk to be 100 gigabytes, and if we do a DF, you're going to see that it is certainly not 100 gigabytes. It is considerably smaller than that. It has a number of used disks, and it has the amount of available, and you can see that it is much smaller, and it's using 24% of that disk currently. So our next step is we're going to do an apt install on both cloud-guest-utils and also fdisk. What that's going to do is it's going to give us a couple of commands that we need in order to enlarge the disk properly. So let's see. We've now completed that operation. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to grow the partition to the full size of the 100 gigabyte disk that we had created when we created the container. So we do a grow part, and it grows the partition size appropriately. So the problem is, at this point in time, our disk still isn't fully enlarged because we need to now enlarge the file system, the root file system inside of that partition that we just grew, and we do that with a resize 2fs command. Now that we've done that, I can clear the screen and I can do a df command, and you can see we're now using only 1% of the disk space on my root device, and you can see that it is a full 100 gigabyte disk. So one thing you may have noticed if you've been watching the channel before where I cover LXD containers, we never have to set a disk size on them because they simply use pool space out of the pool, whereas a LXD VM establishes a particular disk size. So let's move along and do an add user on an account. So I'm going to create a Scott account. I'm going to give the Scott account a password. And then I'm going to do a user mod -a capital G sudo Scott to put Scott in the sudo group. You can notice I'm not using any sudo commands here because when we signed in with the LXC exec bosh, we came in as root. So now that we have a user account, I'm going to go ahead and move over to that user account with an su-Scott, which will move us over to Scott's home directory, and there we are. So now we're ready to install Home Assistant Supervised on our brand new LXD VM container, which has been created. So I'll go ahead and clear the screen, and the first thing we have is a whole bunch of dependencies, and don't worry, these will be in the show notes, and go ahead and look at the show notes and make sure that you perform all these commands as indicated. So we go off here and we are installing all of the dependencies required for both Home Assistant Supervised and the Home Assistant Agent, which are the two components that we're going to install. Next, we're going to install Docker on our Debian instance here, and in order to do that, we're going to have to prepare an area for the keys required, and so I'm creating a key directory with that makedir command. Next thing I'm going to do is download the keys into the location that I just created with this curl command. And after that, we're going to go ahead and make an entry for the repository needed to go install Docker. Now, after we've done that, we're going to go do a sudo apt update to update the repository entry that we just made. And then after we do that, we'll go ahead and install Docker. And we have a few components here. We're going to install Docker CE, and we're going to install the CLI, container IO, and a couple of other components. So we go ahead and say yes, and it goes off and installs those. Now I want to go ahead and add Scott to the Docker group. And then I'm going to do a new group, new GRP, Docker. And then I can do a groups command, and you'll see that Scott is in the Docker group and the sudo group as well as his own group. Now we're going to get a copy of the Home Assistant Agent, which as of this recording is 1.5.1, and you can look out in that location and find out whether there is a newer version. Now that we did the wget and we've downloaded the agent, we can install the agent, and the command to install the agent will be a dpackage install. And so here we go, installing the agent, and the agent is completely installed. Now we're going to download Home Assistant Supervised with this command. And finally, we're going to install Home Assistant Supervised with the dpackage command. And at the end, it goes ahead and tells you that it downloaded. For some reason, it always seems to give you another address, but the real address here is actually the first address that you get back, and then it's going to be port number 8123. So if I bring up a web browser, bring it over here, and paste in that address and go to port 8123, you'll see that it says it is preparing Home Assistant, and it says it can take up to 20 minutes. This all depends on the speed of your LXD VM on your LXD host, but it should come up pretty quickly. So I guess that took about a minute or two, and now I have my Home Assistant login. So I'll go ahead and type Scott and use Scott as my username. And then I'll go ahead and set my password here. And it goes down and asks for the confirmation password. And I set that again, and then I say create account. And then it's going to ask you for the name of your Home Assistant installation. You can give it whatever you want. I just have home in here, and it says would like to know where you live. If you have location services turned on, you can do a detect, and your browser should be able to figure out where you are. You can set your language and time zone and unit system and so on, and then you click next, and it gives you an option now whether or not you want to provide the Home Assistant folks some telemetry. By default, all of these are turned off. I'll go ahead and click next, and then I click finish. So I can go up here under notifications right away, and it says, hey, new devices have been discovered, check it out. And I go check it out, and right now it's just finding devices on my net. So it's found a Bond device that I have, it's found a Brother printer, it's found a Philips Hue hub, it's found my network UPS tools that are being served out, it found my Rachio sprinkler system, it found a Google Homecast, it found I believe another Home Assistant supervisor, my production one I have out there. And it also found my Sonos devices, and it will keep detecting things on your network. Now, if you had your Z-Wave and Zigbee plugged in and you didn't have any of your switches configured because you were doing brand new system automation, then it should be able to go out and detect all of those and allow you to pair them. So anyway, as you can see here, we have a full-blown Home Assistant supervised running inside of a LXD VM. So in summary, Home Assistant supervised can run on a LXD VM with all of the functions and features of the Home Assistant operating system. Z-Wave and Zigbee USB devices can be connected to the LXD host, and a LXC config device add command can enable Home Assistant in order to use them. Home Assistant implemented in a LXD VM provides the power of LXD to take snapshots, export backups, and modify the memory and CPU resources for your Home Assistant installation easily. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you next time.